All right, I'm going to give this a sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. Today we have two, veteran guests coming back. And I wanted to have them on because they're each working on something very relevant, interesting for me, and I think interesting for each other. So we have Pelin Kasar with us.
Hi.
And Juliette Vazard.
Hello.
And so I wanted to bring you both here because, as I've spoken about a bunch, I work on beliefs. And I found out just through hanging out with these two that Pelin is working on biases a bit more. And Juliette has also started thinking a lot about curiosity. And I'm actually going to be spending my work with beliefs always sort of entails bias. So that's kind of an automatic concept. And because I work on sort of the development of learning, curiosity has become more and more of a thing that I think about. And I'm actually going to be spending the whole summer working experimentally trying to disentangle curiosity in children. So that's kind of the main reason why I was motivated to gather you two. But if we could start off by each of you kind of explaining, say what bias is for you and what curiosity is for you, then maybe we can kind of build some kind of common ground and build the conversation from there.
Cool.
Yeah. Should I start?
Sure.
In our last session, we talked about AI responsibility and all. And it's interesting because for me, this whole interest in AI started with first thinking about responsibility in general. And that interest was actually coming from my work in implicit bias, because there's a big question about responsibility in terms of our implicit biases. But maybe first I should say something about what is implicit bias. We are familiar with the idea of bias. We can understand it in a more neutral way, and we can also understand it in a more political way, let's say, and that's the part I'm more interested in. The way I understand bias is right now I'm talking about explicit bias, some kind of beliefs about people, based on their membership in a social category. And implicit version of this is having biases without having awareness of, and more automatic way. And the subject that has the bias against people based on their membership in a socially salient categories, they are not aware of those subjects with implicit biases. They are not aware of whether they have these biases, and those are mostly observed in their actions, behaviors. That's how we infer whether they have biases. Most popular examples come from for example, hiring practices. When people say, "Oh, we care about fairness, equality in hiring people," when we look at the results, and for example, let's say in tech companies and all, even we know that there are women also working in this field, right? But still, in that tech companies, and the number of men are higher, and there must be some explanation behind this. When you ask the people who are hiring these people, they would say, "Yeah, we care about justice and fairness between our candidates," but still there might be some other factors and implicit biases that would influence their decisions. So this might be just one example, but this we can come up with various examples, practices in classrooms, how teachers expectations varies depending on the students' genders and ethnicity and these kind of things. So I'm interested in the nature of implicit bias also. I said that bias is mostly understood in terms of beliefs, but this is not very straightforward in implicit bias. This is a big question whether implicit biases are beliefs. Some people think that they are beliefs, but beliefs are mostly things that we are aware of, right? We say that oh, I believe that P, I believe that something is but with implicit biases, if we are not aware of them, how can we say that they are beliefs? Some say that they are implicit beliefs, but there is a question about because what is implicit belief? So this is another question that needs to be answered. So I'm interested in also the question of like what is implicit bias, like what kind of mental state or category or what is that, like, so that's why I kind of use this very minimal like definition of implicit bias, saying defining in terms of dispositions, like when you are disposed to discriminate against someone based on their social category, like then you are kind of implicitly biased, and many people would agree with this kind of explanation. So yeah, with this definition, I'm not really like limiting myself to any idea about what implicit bias is, whether they are beliefs or like mental imagery or something. There are many different opinions about that.
So you're leaning towards saying that implicit biases are dispositions to act in certain ways, but also, right, reason in certain ways, attend to certain people or certain aspects of people while overlooking others. So those dispositions are not only, they're also subtle cognitive, affective dispositions, right?
Yes. Maybe it's better to say multi-track dispositions instead of single-track. It's not only influencing, like, it is not about what you say or how you act, but also it could be about how you feel, how you, it's about how you attend. Like, it could be manifested in many different ways. So, yeah.
So whether you view someone's testimony as relevant to be taken into account, for example, and these happen very spontaneously without much like pre-deliberative decision making, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I tend to be quite reductionist on the implicit-explicit spectrum and think that they're sort of rooted in the same phenomena. So I take everything to be priors. And, you know, whether we call it beliefs or not, it's sort of a latent term, like you brought up, Pelin, which is that most people take beliefs to have propositional content. And that's why I kind of take it just as like the priors that the system maintains as as like a human agent. You're just a system, a set of priors. And some of these priors have, almost like post hoc prepositions attached to them, which then make them something like explicit. But then you have this implicit area as well, where you're not necessarily aware of it, but you're acting on it. The dispositions that you take, the actions that you take in the world are a reflection of the same sort of subset of priors that you're maintaining. And I do think that there's something about, like, kind of relevant to the conversation we had last time with Katrina, right? Which is like, if I'm a judge and I'm making a sentencing call, then it's very likely that there's some kind of implicit bias acting there. But maybe if you dig further into what people think about something, like say a statistical distribution, some kind of likelihood, maybe you can sort of reveal an implicit bias and make it explicit. And that's kind of why I guess whether or not I'm aware of something that I believe, I don't give too much credence to the awareness and more of sort of the output of the system as such.
And most of the time, this is how you infer, like, whether someone is implicitly biased or not, like, because introspectively you cannot know it. So it must be somehow like after effect of what you already did, or some observation about your action, or it doesn't always have to be about after effect, but some kind of based on the observations you had in the past, predicting how you would behave, like, yeah.
So you think phenomena like implicit biases can be entirely explained by beliefs in the broad sense of belief that you have in mind? How about those forms of implicit biases that manifest mainly through like affective responses or emotions?
Yeah, that's why I think it's better to describe them as the priors that the system maintains. And that's kind of why I've shied away from the use of the word belief in this context, because I agree that it's useful to have something that has propositional content. And so I think the word prior maybe of the system as a whole is what we're talking about. So I think how you feel about something, the affective reaction, is very telling. It's sort of internal evidence as to what you think about something. the priors that you have, the dispositions that you have towards particular information or context, which is something like an experiment you can do on your own. Whereas we might try to reveal implicit bias, and there are a lot of experiments testing implicit bias, where the experimenter is able to, or attempts to pull the priors out of the individual through an experimental setup. Anytime you're engaging with something and you don't realize you have some kind of priors about something, but you have an affective reaction, that's a little sort of self-experiment where you're like, okay, cool, I can use this information, or I can ignore it, or I can avoid it, or I can be in denial. But these are all sort of the way the priors play out as you go about the world. That's how I would interpret it.
What's the relationship between priors and dispositions to act according to those priors?
I would say the prior is what's maintained, the disposition is the output.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so the dispositions are, so they're, the manifestations of the dispositions are the actual outputs.
Effectively, right? Because you have some, it depends on where in the causal chain you want to put it, but as a system goes, I'd say the thing that they maintain is the prior. And then when we're trying to make sense of it, we can call it a disposition towards information. I think that priors and dispositions aren't so easy to disentangle.
Mm-hmm.
To me, they might be the same thing, in that it's the output of the prior. You take the system, you put information in, the prior, there's some kind of prior there, it engages with the information, and then the output is the disposition or the bias.
Mm-hmm.
Does that match
so
with how you see it?
we could potentially reformulate priors as our way of processing our tendencies to process information in a certain way, such that we will tend to produce certain outputs.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that they're probabilistically stored, and that you might not get the exact same output, but that there's some kind of sort of distribution there, and that the prior is going to be the likelihood. And if you have you can have something like flat priors regarding some set of information. If you have no knowledge, you could produce a random output every time. But something that you engage with more and more often, you collect that information, you're probably going to behave quite similarly to something every time. Maybe certain things will shift, where in the mid-range you are with behavior. Like, I have this belief, I'm going to react this way to this thing, but maybe next time I'll be a little less upset, these things. But the distribution is roughly the same. So yeah, I would say that is the way I would make sense of it.
Sorry, just for the clarification, you talk about priors and you are avoiding using the notion of belief here, or where I just try to find the role of belief in this whole picture a bit.
Yeah, I would say beliefs are useful in a certain context and priors are useful. To me, it depends on which level of explanation you're trying to make.
I see.
If you're trying to understand how the individual behaves in a given way, then I would say you're probably dealing with priors. But if you're dealing with the more social aspects of human behavior, if you're dealing with cognitive science as a social science, as opposed to say more of a natural or philosophical science, then you're dealing with beliefs. If I'm dealing with political beliefs, it's beliefs. But then if I'm trying to get beneath that and understand the cognitive mechanisms, I would say you're probably dealing with the priors.
I see. And you take beliefs as propositional or not? Because, as a person coming from philosophy, this is the standard way of treating beliefs. They are propositional mental states. They have a propositional content.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say they can be expressed as propositions, but does the individual maintain them as propositions? I'm doubtful.
I see.
I'm doubtful because I can produce the propositions at any given point, whether they're political in nature or not. I can say, I'm pretty sure this chair is pretty stable, but I didn't need to voice that. And you didn't need to have thought about whether your chairs are stable before I said that, but you were maintaining that prior. But then it sort of turns into a belief almost because now it has propositional content. And I ask you guys, do you think your chairs are safe? And you're like, yeah, okay, they seem all right. So that's why I think it's such a blurry line. But I would say priors are primal in that sense.
I see. Yeah, this whole discussion about we philosophers taking beliefs as propositional mental states also has some direct the research on implicit bias a bit, because there are psychologists working on implicit bias. There are philosophers trying to figure out the nature of implicit biases, and it matters how you treat attitudes in general. Like another way of talking about implicit bias is like implicit attitudes. And in philosophy, attitudes are like mental states that has propositional contents. But in psychology, attitudes are actually not like that. Like I know less in that field, but it is more about like associations. Like for example, you have this one concept, woman, let's say, and the other concept, weakness, let's say, and then if you take it as a propositional mental state, what attitude is, then the bias we have would be women are weak, right? Like, but if you take it as an association, like what attitude is, then it would be like an association between two concepts. There's no predication relationship between woman and weakness. It is like we have this concept in mind, woman, we have weakness, and sometimes some stimuli triggers it, and then we just have this action, like outcome that is because of this trigger. But they are not really connected in this propositional sense. So it's a reason for to think that maybe they are not beliefs also, because since we take beliefs as like propositional mental states, so implicit biases, since many psychologists think that they're associations, and the whole research about implicit bias started with implicit association test, where people were categorizing like concepts and their speed was like measured. So it is important to take this evidence into account and not treat them as like propositional. So that's a reason to not take them as beliefs as well. Like there's this whole debate about are they propositional or are they associations?
How do you think this whole discussion, this whole debate, I imagine you've thought about this through your research, how does this impact the question of how do we go about finding out about our own biases and potentially modifying them?
Yeah, I always treat this whole subject as like has stages, like you first ask what is it, and then you ask, okay, how you combat with it or how you figured, like, so this question is important because like, as I said, if you take them as, for example, associations or so, like some people think that you can detect your biases by taking those tests, like you can go online and you can take this test and you can, your speed of associating concepts will be measured, and then in the end you will have the answer, okay, you are implicitly biased or something like that. Personally, I'm not sure this is like a very great way of detecting your biases. Like there are other ways, but introspection is definitely not very promising, because if it is defined as this thing that you are not even aware of, you cannot just reflect on your thoughts and say, oh, like I have it or not. I think the best way is somehow having this responsibility, but like forward-looking responsibility, let's say. We all, now the research on implicit bias is like everywhere. Like maybe, I don't know, 50 years ago it wasn't that much, but right now everybody, even in the like common discourse or mainstream discourse, people talk about implicit biases. So even if you know that there's this phenomenon that people are researching and all, so there's a big chance that you also have it. So that's like a good starting point to say, okay, I might have implicit biases. Probably I have implicit biases. Like everyone has implicit biases. So it is about observing your actions, observing your decisions. Like maybe you cannot see it by just thinking about it, but you can observe your behaviors, and you can figure it out whether you have it or not. Like I think it's about more being critical about your own actions and not having this whole automatic, like very fast like patterns that you have in life. Maybe that's something actually where connects the whole curiosity thing, like because when you are curious about something, you have more like you pay attention, like you are slower, like you are not acting automatically. Like when you are curious about something, when something gets your attention and all, you just look at it, you try to figure it out. It's not this automatic pattern that you have and you act on it. So maybe I find almost being curious and being questioned about some other people or things could be a way of also thinking, combating with biases. I don't know.
Yes, although most of the time our curiosity, like most other emotions, are spontaneous responses. The curiosity that you're talking about is an act of self-reflection, of taking one's own reactions, actions as somehow odd and surprising. So I think it takes a certain amount of self-observation to become surprised by your own acts and becoming curious. It's a meta state, it's a meta emotion, becoming curious about your own emotional reaction or your own action. But it's certainly insofar as curiosity is a powerful source of motivation into the quest for insight or knowledge or understanding. It's certainly helpful.
That's interesting. Yeah, so there are a couple of things I want to circle back on. Okay, so are you taking curiosity to be an affective state when you said it? Okay, I see. Mm-hmm. Yep. Because then because the definition that I would have is slightly different, because I do think that there is an affective component involved, but I guess I take it more kind of trying to understand it within the network of priors, in that kind of the same way that when Pelin was describing associations, like the way I would say associations then relate to beliefs is if you call attention to an association, you can say strengthen the connection between two concepts. So if it's, banana and tastiness, then I can sort of merge those two concepts with attention. And the more I engage with those two things, then if I was building a network model, I would just add weight to the connection between those two. And then there's a greater association. So next time you probe me about bananas, I produce what we would call a belief like bananas are tasty, right? So that, but I would say that still the underlying concept there is like an association and a network. And I would say when there's curiosity, there needs to be sort of sufficient set of priors there. Sort of they need to be not flat enough. They need to be they need to have some kind of distribution where you can produce an output of the relative concepts there. Because if I have zero information, then I might not even understand that there's information to gain.
Of course, I agree with that.
So then there's a minimum amount of information that I can have, and there's almost this a recognition of the gap in knowledge that I have to maintain.
Of course.
Okay, cool. And then there's also sort of positive and negative affect that can be produced by the engagement with the information. And I can also have an anticipation about the positive and negative affect that I can get. So if I receive a doctor's report and I think it might have bad information, I still might be curious about it. I might avoid it, but I might be curious. And when I might expect negative news and I'm curious and I open it and I get negative news. Or obviously it can be a positive outcome and I'm expecting positive outcome and I open it as positive, So curiosity, I think, doesn't necessarily have a necessary valence to it. It can kind of be valenced either way. Does any of that track for you?
I think I see curiosity in a bit more narrow sense, not just as any instance of us desiring to know something or wanting to know something or needing to know something. And it's just by the nature of the things I'm interested in. I'm more interested in purely intellectual curiosity, the kind of curiosity that manifests a desire to know something that is for its own sake, for the value of gaining that knowledge, not for any further means, not instrumentally. So, if I need to refill my medication and I come to, really want to know whether the pharmacy that's close to me is open at this hour, that's not sufficient for attributing curiosity about whether the pharmacy is open. I just simply I need to know this information because of what I want to achieve, refill my medication. I would be tempted to leave curiosity for those instances in which, I have a strong interest in Sheila's paintings of a certain era, and then I have a set of priors, expectations about what his paintings of that era look like, and then I'm told or I'm shown a painting that looks kind of different. So it's unexpected. There's an element of surprise. There's not only an element of novelty with respect to what I expect to find in the world, given my background and my prior knowledge. There is an element of surprise that violates kind of my expectations in the relevant domain of knowledge. And this is what's going to trigger my curiosities. As you said, I already know enough about that domain to identify which elements or events or changes are surprising, given what I already know. They violate the expectations that I have built on that domain, given what I already know. And given that I'm interested, I want to know. I want to resolve this kind of incongruency between my expectations and the event that I just witnessed. I was shown a painting, and it's incongruent with what I know of Sheila's style at that era. And so I want to now understand. I have this motivation to resolve this kind of tension.
But what about, so it's interesting because then the violation of expectation almost has an instrumental use case. And are you saying violation of expectation is necessary? Because if I could say I like Sheila's paintings and therefore I buy a book on Sheila's paintings just because I want to see more of Sheila's paintings. Mm-hmm. And so there's no violation of expectation there.
So you would say I buy books on Sheila's paintings because I'm curious?
Yeah.
Okay, so here are two importantly different senses of curiosity. There's curiosity as a disposition. So I am generally curious about new electronic music. And saying that just means, it doesn't mean that right now I'm going around asking myself all sorts of actively, engaging with the topic and asking myself all sorts of questions about what new album came out. It just means that I'm the kind of agent, if you want to predict my behavior, you say, she's curious about electronic music, and that will explain why if we pass by, a CD store or a poster of this electronic music concert, I will be disposed to turn around and say, oh, let's go inside. Oh, this artist is playing. So that's a dispositional sense. Okay. And then there's the episodic sense of at that moment in which I go in the CD store and I see the range that they have, and there's a new album I didn't know about, and it looks very intriguing. The cover, it's different from what I know of this artist, and then I'll become genuinely curious about what this artist has now produced, and this will motivate me in the moment to ask myself all sorts of questions and to go about and inquire and buy the CD and listen to it. And so that's an episode, that's a mental event that unfolds in time, live, as you're standing outside and just waiting.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So then you have, I like that distinction. So you have a dispositional state of curiosity about a set of things. Then you have an episodic one, which says you identify a gap, or the gap could even be what's in there. I like this thing. Let me go see what is in there. Yeah, that's quite interesting. And then you have, and would you classify the instrumental state? Because instrumentality is sort of a slippery slope because, if you ask some psychologists and cognitive psychologists, they would say that anything that you're interested in is also like a reputation management, and therefore any sort of episodic state of curiosity is a reputation management because you like to see yourself as knowledgeable about this thing. So it's like instrumental towards selfhood. But you're saying like instrumentality outside of, well, no, it still includes the self. Instrumentality that doesn't, yeah, what's the gradient there?
I understand what you mean, but the idea is that I'm not motivated to acquire this specific piece of knowledge for practical as a means to achieve practical ends that I'm aware of.
Right. Like a stateable outcome, say.
Like
an outcome that you can state. Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That's fair.
Right.
And so the instrumentality, do you consider that curiosity, but it's not within the domain you're interested in, or that's not curiosity for you?
I would be reluctant to calling all of those instances in which we like feel like we need to like acquire a specific piece of knowledge curiosity, just because some of these instances, as like I just need to know whether the pharmacy is open, are not characterized by what I'm interested in. Curiosity is that this partly affective state, this intrinsic motivation, this intrinsic reward we experience in acquiring a piece of knowledge for its own sake, such that when we acquire it, we'll feel this satisfaction, this reward, and which motivates us to acquire more knowledge in that domain. That makes us the creatures that we are. We are intrinsically motivated to acquire knowledge for its own sake, because we are curious creatures, meaning we're like endowed with this piece of affective equipment whereby when we come across a change in the world, an event, an input, a stimulus, which is surprising given our priors, we will be intrinsically motivated to go inquire into that and resolve it, and thereby improve our understanding of how the world around us and the people in it and the things in it work.
I like that a lot. I'm going to provide two small things that I think are counter, though, with regard to negative valence. Like, if you have, say, I learned that you two are gossiping about me, right? I'd have no use case. There's no outcome that I will use. It's not necessarily instrumental, but I want to find out what you two have said, even if I think it might be negatively valenced. And I'm not going to confront you two, but I still want to know what people think of me. And so that, I think, is like one example of general curiosity that I would say is curiosity about the self. I would also think like of things like why a car crash or a train wreck is difficult to look away from. No instrumental use. I think that there's a long-term instrumentality. Like, I think that we are sort of minimizing the long-term potential of negative outcomes. At least that's what we feel when we are gathering information about negative situations. And I also think that that's what drives a lot of animal behavior. Like, corvids go and just observe the death of another corvid. Like, if a corvid is dead, like a crow, crows will gather after the crow's already been dead. Like, they just observe. So it's not like something's actively killing it. They'll just look at the dead crow and then just watch it. And it's not like they're mourning it. They're gathering information there. That's what we think, in experimental paradigms. And the same way that like a dog might like sense something and be curious and then kind of chase something down. So I don't know. I guess I like your account a lot. I guess the only thing I would say is that I do think that there are times when we do expect a negative valence, but it's curiosity for the sake of knowing something larger without like, is the pharmacy open or not?
Okay, so these cases like seem pretty complex. So first, let's take the case of morbid curiosity. So curiosity at extreme events. I would say, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but I would say morbid curiosity is generally a curiosity directed at like events that are like extremely rare, or it's really unexpected. Again, like given like the range of things, the spectrum of things that you expect to happen reasonably, in the world, given what you've experienced in your life before, then you encounter that scene that is beyond that spectrum. It's extreme. It breaks the boundaries of what you thought was possible in terms of occurrences in the world. All of a sudden, someone's done something you didn't know was possible, And even if it's terrible and gory and cruel, it still merits curiosity in the sense that it expands your information store about the range of events that are possible in this world. And so it's very, very valuable information that fits my definition in that it violates your expectation about what's possible.
Like, even if you know that cars are one of the most dangerous, sitting in a car is one of the most dangerous activities you can take. So it's like a sort of sub-cognitive, it's like a cognitive level of uncertainty. It's not like, I can tell you that like cars are extremely dangerous and one of the biggest killers, car accidents. But then I can see a car accident and it can still violate that expectation.
Yeah,
not because I cognitively don't expect it, just because there's like a violation there at a lower level.
Yeah. And
Okay.
it's more fine-grained than that. When I'm looking at the result of the car crash, I'm not trying to learn whether car crashes are possible.
Yes.
I'm trying to learn what are the range of possible things that can happen as a result of a car crash. Can your head come
Nice.
apart,
Yep.
your torso, can your feet,
Yep. No, convincing.
more fine-grained
Nice.
knowledge about how your body might look like on the other end of such an event.
Right.
I want to bring this discussion back to bias a little bit, because as I understand from this discussion right now, merely questioning is not curiosity. It needs definitely more than that. So when you question whether you have biases or something, that's not really curiosity, because you also do it for the sake of to know whether you have bias so that you can detect and fight against it or something like it's more instrumental.
Can you be curious about yourself in this sense?
I think so. I don't know whether everyone would agree with this, but I think it makes perfect sense that we are all always curious about we are, right? How are we evolving? What do we think? How we would react to situations? At least I could say that I'm very curious about myself all the time. So maybe you could put it in a way that this kind of curiosity would be possible, that I'm curious about my reactions towards things, my decisions, how I react to situations, whether I am a fair person, whether I'm just this kind of self-knowledge is, I can be, maybe this would be curiosity in your sense, maybe?
Yeah, and I think it could, to the extent that, we can say that I'm interested in knowing about myself purely for the sake of gaining self-knowledge, because self-knowledge is valuable in and of itself. And usually, in the typical case, we would engage in these inquiries about ourselves and our biases out of curiosity as a result of us having produced a certain remark, a certain action, or even a certain thought pattern that we see as incongruous or unexpected or surprising, given what we think of ourselves, given the kind of values we take ourselves to have, the kind of commitments, maybe moral commitments we take ourselves to have. We will have this moment of self-reflection as a result of having actually done something. And, if the most self-reflective among us will take a minute and become curious about how could I produce this action? How could I produce this association, this thought pattern, this pattern of attention. Do I do this regularly? Is this a tendency that I've displayed in other environments, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, there's this surprise effect is definitely there. For example, when you implicit bias is mostly characterized in those cases like where the person says that they, let's say, like have an egalitarian belief, but their action suggests the otherwise, right? So when this person discovers that they acted on their implicit biases, there is this moment that, how did I do that? Like, I'm so surprised about this. Like, I wouldn't think that I would decide my decision would be influenced by my biases. So this is kind of like the starting point for discovering and like detecting your biases. So, yeah.
But of course, in different people, discovering that you have just produced a behavior that stands in contradiction with the values you take yourself to have can trigger a whole host of reactions. Like, obviously, you can be very resistant to admitting that you can, try to rationalize a posteriori, and so showing curiosity can be a sign of virtue, can be a sign of open-mindedness. So that's one virtuous reaction you can have to discovering your own incongruences or your own contradictions. And there's a whole host of vicious reactions you can have to that as well. And of course, the self-knowledge that will be yielded from that episode depends largely on whether you will deploy vicious, virtuous meta reactions to your behavior and your awareness of that behavior.
I like that. Because I was gonna say something about this, since I'm interested in this whole idea of how can curiosity be a tool for fighting against biases, like implicit biases. It needs to be something that you cultivate also, like whether can you cultivate like curiosity, like, because if I want to propose that like, oh, this could be a tool, then there must be ways of like figuring out how can be more curious about ourselves, and I like this idea that it is a virtue actually, because like yes, you're right, the first reaction actually many people give also when they are told that they shown biases is resisting, like no, this is not what I think, no, I had other reasons, I didn't act on my biases or something. It's a virtue that you actually take this comment and feedback and then you reflect on your action. Yeah, I like this.
Yeah, it's curiosity can be like a reliable tendency to maybe override those negative feelings that are there of, resistance, of course, becoming aware of your own inconsistencies is unpleasant, but you can also recognize those reasons to maybe persist in your ignorance of yourself, but you can see the other reasons, the reasons to take this opportunity to engage in self-inquiry as overriding the reasons that you might have to remain ignorant about yourself and not make a fool of yourself, not humiliate yourself, not appear as an inconsistent person. And curiosity is the habit, in a way, the integrated habit of recognizing and responding to those reasons in priority, the reasons for taking whatever episode, whatever behavior you've produced as an opportunity for improving your epistemic access to your priors, your beliefs, your tendencies.
Yeah, it's interesting because violation of expectation triggers learning. Like, this is just kind of how we deal with learning. And there's sort of learning in the sense that we typically discuss learning, sort of in the broad colloquial sense of learning, which kind of is predicated upon violation of expectation. And then there's sort of the super category of learning, which also includes even when you accept evidence that you already accept, because it just adds evidence to justify the pre-existing belief. And it's interesting when you're faced with a bias and you see yourself as someone who doesn't have that bias, then it's a violation of expectation. And like Juliette said, it can kind of, the updating happens, but it can go in either direction. It can sort of reinforce, and you can seek justifications. Well, I think this, and I didn't realize I was biased, but really when I think about it, I'm right because of this. And so that kind of takes it from, say, an implicit to an explicit. And so there's this interesting thing is a bias being a refusal to accept a gap in knowledge, which I think is also quite interesting. So I can be biased against something, and therefore I'm not curious because I think I know. And it's interesting because bias is a much larger category than what curiosity can contain, because everything, in a sense, can have an informational bias. You can look at the behavior of a bacterium and say it's biased against certain things. It's just the output of the behavior, the dispositions that it might have. So I think that this limiting bias in the sort of implicit explicit sense then gives us a very good narrower subset of bias that then, like you guys were just doing, can then be discussed in the context of curiosity, and then say, okay, yeah, how do we get people to be more curious? How do we reduce their biases? And that kind of takes us to like a whole body of literature that tries to look at, say, openness. That's kind of the operationalized term in cognitive psychology, especially dealing with things like, there's a lot of racial and gender bias work, but especially in the last decade, there's climate science work of how do we get people to understand they don't know about the climate? How do we get them to be open to this kind of thing, or to reduce polarization on the political spectrum? So is this kind of cogent with where you see the applications for curiosity research? And does that kind of match with how you do you're thinking about bias as well, like this sort of narrower set?
I didn't think that actually, now that you say it, I also realized it's actually useful, this whole implicit explicit distinction. Like it really also, because when you think about it in explicit terms, like it doesn't really directly connect with curiosity so much. For example, it's not so much about questioning yourself, knowing yourself and all, but once you focus on the implicit part, like the more narrower domain, then you have other ways of figuring out, and other aims that also important in relation to implicit biases, because then you also think about knowing yourself, then you also think about like questioning or being curious about yourself.
Yeah, one thing that you said, maybe just correct me if I'm understanding this wrong. I think one important thing that you said is that there is this just much broader notion of bias as just a tendency to select, just a tendency to, in given environments, attend to certain things, choose certain actions, and overlook. So bias doesn't need to have this normative aspect to it. It doesn't need to be the expression of like a vice, like cruelty or inequality. And that would be a very important distinction to emphasize if what we want to produce in people are, tolerance of ignorance. Like being biased is just part of our natural conditioning of how our system works. And you don't need to have so much resistance to the idea that you're conditioned, to the idea that you hold there are contradictions, incongruencies among your priors, and you don't have pure total self-knowledge. So the appropriate reaction to your own behaviors is that of open-mindedness, curiosity, humility, and it seems that there's parts of the discourse on implicit bias is maybe not helping us getting rid of the shame that prevents us from openly displaying this curiosity and just having a discussion about how we're conditioned.
Definitely. I mean, the work all looks at validation being one of the core ways of generating openness, right? Because people don't feel triggered. The best thing is to validate. And this kind of brings us to the fact that priors are, and effectively biases, therefore, are pitted against each other in a sort of a hierarchy of how I prioritize internally. And the thing that people typically are biased towards in general is their conception of themselves. So that you can expect that that's pretty high up in the hierarchy, and that other things are lower. But that there's a way to say I have a bias against a certain shape of chair, but then I also have a bias, or we're talking about priors here. Like I have a prior that this type of chair is not that comfortable, but then I have a prior that my friend who's an architect and designs chairs knows a lot about chairs. If the prior that the architect is a valuable opinion is prioritized over the chair shape, then these two biases will play out against each other, and then one might be resolved in favor of the other. I might say, I had this different conception of the chair, but actually when I sit in it for a long time, my back is feeling much better. So maybe, these kind of, and so I think that's interesting to see that kind of offers us an avenue in to allow for the undoing of biases, to allow for people to shift how they view their concepts.
I just want to delve into a little bit more in this idea that what we are curious about could be shaped by our biases. Because I was thinking this example, for example, you gave looking at a painting and being curious about it. For example, let's imagine this case that we are told that this painting is by Schiele, and the same another painting is done by someone unknown artist or something. And then I can easily imagine that people would be more curious about the well-known artist, the painting done by the well-known artist, Gilles. And this is some kind of a biased way of being curious about, because before you get curious, you have this point of contact, let's say, you are struck by something, you perceive something, you hear something maybe, and looking at this painting is very much influenced by your information about who made this painting.
Yes.
So I don't know what you think about this.
That's why, for a long time, and still today, a lot of people in psychology define curiosity as a state directed at the unknown or the novel. But as you said, I think curiosity is, we experience curiosity towards what we already have enough information about, so as to detect the incongruencies. We need to already have enough knowledge stored about a domain in order for us to actually improve our learning, in order for us to learn. So that's where I think some of my research right now is on how curiosity, this specific response to the surprising or the unexpected, is maybe not the only affective state that allows us to kind of explore the world and learn about our world. But we also need more kind of general exploratory tendencies to kind of be motivated to come into contact with domains that we don't know in the first place. And that's where I've started to think a little bit about interest and how we develop interests and how we experience the initial impetus to just come into contact with unknown objects, unknown domains, unknown artists, even when we haven't yet identified a specific question, a specific inconsistency. So curiosity seems to me to be this very targeted response whereby we've identified an incongruency and we're motivated to resolve it, whereby interest is this more exploratory, open-ended search that then motivates us to look at a domain with a much broader gaze and then get curious about specific aspects within it and acquire specific pieces of knowledge as a result.
I see that. So that distinction between interest and curiosity is important for you. Like interest is some kind of like a starting point for maybe getting curious about it or something, but definitely different.
I think so. I mean, I'm exploring how they might complement each other. But it seems to me that at least if we define curiosity in this narrow way, in which a lot of philosophers have been doing lately, it seems to me that it needs to be complemented with a more broader motivation towards open-ended exploration, where once you've resolved a specific incongruency thanks to your response of curiosity and you're satisfied, you're not going to stop there. You're going to keep looking and attending at this object, maybe for decades. It seems to me that we're creatures in search of knowledge for its own sake, and that leads us to do things that other animals don't, like embark on these long intellectual projects of, Stanley Cavell studied King Lear by Shakespeare for decades. How do we explain? Was he just like curious about specific novel or incongruous aspects? Did he just keep being curious? And I think one way to explain how us humans, given our specific relationship to knowledge, how we just sustain those long inquiries that come to define us. He's a literary critic, she's a birder, she's an electronic music fan, is that we have these long-standing interests, these intrinsic motivation to remain in close contact, perceptual contact, cognitive contact with the objects of our interest. And that fuels our punctual episodes of curiosity that are very specific and targeted. But on the other side, once those curiosities are resolved, we keep being interested. And that's how, at the end, maybe after decades of those long intellectual inquiries or projects, you've acquired a sort of deep, not only isolated pieces of knowledge, but deep understanding of how all this knowledge connects to one another, because you've just been motivated to keep attending kind of an open-ended way at this domain, at this object, out of interest.
I like that you brought this notion of interest on the table, because I think this may be even more useful in the context of like bias, because saying that you should be more curious about other people, you should be curious about yourself, maybe even too demanding, like you cannot expect from people, for the sake of combating bias, that they will be curious about everyone's perspective, different people's perspective, like is historically disadvantaged people's perspective. That would be ideal, but also too demanding to ask such a thing. But showing interest is like relatively like less demanding, so that could be a better way of just suggesting that combating with bias interest could be more useful, I think.
Because the distinction is that in order to become curious, as we were saying earlier, you need to have enough prior knowledge on someone's perspective, and maybe you don't. Maybe you don't have enough knowledge about what their life is like in order to detect specific incongruencies that you will become curious about. But what you can have is interest. Interest doesn't require previous knowledge. It requires you to care to attend, though. Yeah. Care to learn, care to just remain attentive, so that you may learn something. And then as you learn something, you may learn enough to then become curious about specific things and ask specific questions.
Just one last thing about this, like when you have those stereotypes or in your mind, you kind of flatten people, you know, like you just think you know about them. So that's why you don't show interest in them. Like, so this somehow the bias is affecting your, whether you have an interest or whether you are curious about them, like what they say and all. So yeah, this is something definitely disrupting curiosity and interest.
Yeah, I think this is why one of the most important things is historical biases in publishing, which then plays like fully through our education system. You know, is that most of the published books are by white men, and so you might just have this bias as you're growing up that when you see a book by white male author, you might be more curious about that thing, and you might think, oh well, that there's some kind of extra cultural value or that there's extra cultural worth, or you might not even notice that you're defaulting to. And so I guess that's why in a larger point, why we have to have sort of diversity of opinion and experience presented to individuals at a very young age, so that our education system can be more integrated to undo these sort of harsh biases, which is basically just blindness to the worth of something, which maybe is like at the crux of what you're getting at with implicit bias.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of interesting aspect as well that kind of comes up. Like I'm trying to tease apart interest and curiosity. And is it the same as what you mentioned earlier of sort of a dispositional curiosity versus an episodic curiosity? Is it the same thing?
In the same way as we can be said to be curious, just in the sense that we have a set of dispositions to inquire, ask questions about a certain domain, and we can be just episodically curious at a given moment, asking a specific question about a thing. We can be said to be generally interested. We can have interests, and we can take interests. So at a given moment, I can take an interest in what she has to say, or in this passage from this book, perhaps because I have a general interest in this kind of literature, or in listening to different voices. So I think there is a dispositional sense, and there is a sense in which we take an interest, and when we take an interest in a certain stimuli, we're not motivated by a specific question, in the sense that curiosity, at least in philosophy, is thought to be driven by our attempt to answer a specific question, to resolve a specific incongruency. With interest, the gaze is much broader. The search is much more open-ended. I don't go into my inquiry with as much bias because I don't know really what I'm trying to find out. I just generally want to learn more about what I'm taking an interest in. And so I don't, I'm still working this out. I don't know if you're convinced, but tying back to what you were just saying a moment ago, I think the way in which curiosity and interest complement each other in our motivation towards knowledge maybe has to do with the trade-off between exploitation and exploration. So curiosity, in a way, if I was on the right track, and curiosity is this disposition to kind of identify incongruencies within domains of knowledge we already know about, is exploiting what I already know to learn more about domains that I already know enough about. Interest allows us to explore beyond. It allows us to discover new aspects, new domains that we wouldn't necessarily become curious about because we don't have yet the relevant background of knowledge to ask specific questions about them. And so, in as much as we need to explore new domains, if we don't want to just remain stuck with what we were just conditioned to know about and learn about, interest is an important epistemic motivation to have.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up explore exploit, because that's what I was going to use almost as a rebuttal. Because I think that I like the idea of that you make the distinction between, say, dispositional curiosity and episodic. Or I like the idea that there's curiosity, which would then kind of be episodic, and then interest, which would be dispositional. And I think that this almost like 4-tier system is almost too complicated, too cumbersome. And I like the idea that either you have curiosity and interest, or just 2-factored curiosity. Because I think that the explore exploit is the general way to look at things, and I think that's a good way to frame curiosity. Because you have so much of learning that is contextual, because you have so much of motivations that are contextual. I can be motivated to explore a curiosity, or I could be motivated to go eat lunch, right? And it's going to be temporally bound, because if I'm not hungry, my motivation to lunch is going to be diminished, right? And so at any moment, the motivation to go to the bathroom could pop up. So like there's this temporal and contextual. I walk past a CD store, that's contextual. And so I think that the explore exploit is kind of a good way to think about curiosity. And I find your argument there very, very convincing, because I think that generally, if I'm taking an interest in something, I would say that I'm curious about it, even if it's to build up my knowledge about a thing, because I'm curious dispositionally to say, like, what does it mean to have this type of knowledge? Or if I'm cracking open a book about the immune system, then I'm interested in gaining the knowledge, which then might generate specific instances of curiosity. But one other specific thing that I might push back on is that you have a specific question in mind with curiosity, because I can be very strongly motivated in an instant. Sort of there's an episodic sense, and I guess I could frame it as a question, but sometimes the question is so broad that isn't necessary to add that as a caveat, like as a necessary component.
Yeah, that's very complicated and pressing issue about the nature of curiosity, about whether it is about a question, whether there's always a question behind, even whether you could always formulate the object of curiosity as a question, as broad as it might.
Again.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess a good indication that a subject approaches a given object or domain or a text with curiosity as a main epistemic motivation is to see whether their search is biased in certain ways or directed or guided. Because questions are not only things that pop into our mind, they are things that guide and restrict the kinds of inquiries that you're going to be disposed to engage in. Like if what you want to know, some people argue that bees, are something like curious, because clearly sometimes they engage in behaviors whereby they seem to be hesitant about where is home. Whether or not bees can be curious, it's clear that there's a direct relationship between if the question that's guiding you, whether or not you're tokening the question in your mind is where is X, then your inquiry is going to take the shape of looking for a location. If your curiosity is guided by the question, what is X? Your inquiry is going to take a shape that's going to be very different. The questions are inquiry shaping. And I'm just curious about those inquiries that don't seem to be restricted or guided or constrained in this manner, such that we would say that the subject is guided by a specific question.
Yeah, I think that's important, because all of biological life deals with information. It sort of clusters of information, deals with information, learns. Bacteria learn. So then, if we say that what bees are doing when they're gathering information is exploring a curiosity, then I think it's wise to say, hold on a minute. That's maybe curiosity has something more of like an abstract aim, which I like the way you've sort of framed that. I think that it's not directly instrumental, even if we can have some kind of evolutionary explanation for why we have curiosity. There is something that doesn't have a directly perceivable outcome, isn't directly instrumental. So even if I'm broadly curious about cognitive science, being that's what I do, we wouldn't say that when I'm reading, we wouldn't say that my active day-to-day work as a cognitive scientist is my curiosity. Like, okay, so if I see a paper with a particular headline and I'm like, I should read this paper, but that's curiosity. Like specific instances.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. I'm with you.
When you said that bees can be curious, I was like, wow, you need to, because for me, like the way I understand curiosity was always like related to the capacity to question, like to be able to form questions and all, like, but doesn't have to be. As far as I can see, you don't think that those capacities are needed maybe to be curious?
I'm not committed to any particular claims on this, but yeah, that's a real question about whether. So intuitively, you would take language.
Yeah, that's why
to be necessary for curiosity. But so does that mean that you would say you would take pre-linguistic humans or humans who don't master language, such as very small children, not to be capable of curiosity?
Language is also another debate, no? Like whether children has something like a language,
a proto-language.
Like, yeah. So I'm not sure I would have a straightforward answer, but I think one could still defend the view that still language is kind of the capacity to form a language or something like the proto-language. Would be like making this all happen, the curiosity or something.
At least this definition of it. Because children are definitely observing. The slippery slope is children are always observing what other adults do, right? Even what other children are doing. And if you take pre-linguistic infants and you say that their observations of human behavior are based in curiosity, then you have to say that what corvids do is curiosity. I don't think you can make that distinction. And you have to say that when a dog is observing what you do, you can't say it's not curiosity because it's observing your behavior with no direct application, right? Mm-hmm. Unless you're making some kind of argument that you might be looking for food. But dogs are pretty good at associations. If they see you running outside of the house and they're observing you, so that I think that maybe restricting, especially this type of definition of curiosity to linguistic is maybe not a bad way to go, even if it doesn't necessarily need to have, even if the instances of your episodic curiosity don't need to have propositional content, like you can phrase it propositionally if asked, maybe that's an important aspect of it.
What interests you about curiosity?
Yeah, the main thing for me is how humans do what they do, right? As a cognitive scientist, I feel like the foundational question for me is how did we get here, right? And so that's why I do cognitive science research. And so with curiosity, it's how do we take abstract concepts, how do we sort of are able to abstract information from the environment and then create information upon information abstractly, and there's something there that is driving that. And so that's why curiosity interests me, is that it's like a subset of learning that's driven by a particular affective state that can be extremely abstract. Like this conversation I find extremely interesting, right? But why do we find it interesting? That's for me is kind of one of the main motivations of why I do cognitive science in general. But why do you find curiosity interesting?
I guess so. I'm part of this. I'm a postdoc researcher right now as part of this project called Knowledge in Crisis, which is an FWF Cluster of Excellence project happening across all Austria.
Incidentally, you both are.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
In differing degrees, yes. Which is a philosophical project with the attempt to understand the current threats to knowledge related to misinformation, the post-truth era, maybe the arising of AI and its place in the lives of people increasingly. And my interest was to try and understand this topic from the point of view of I see a lot of people nowadays, including me, just struggling to keep paying attention to what we're actually interested in. So, a lot of people complain that they have no time to read the books that they actually want to read, or like acquire the knowledge in the domains that they're like actually interested in. And this seems to me important when we so how do we allocate our attention when we want to learn about specific things? And as I was saying, I think there's something specific about humans, is that we have this capacity and this drive to get intellectually interested in certain topics and maintain this interest and do a deep dive and gain deep understanding into, the solar system, electronic music, plants, creatures, art, you name it. So we have the capacity to embark and sustain these long intellectual projects, but there are things that increasingly get in the way of us doing so and sustaining this project. And this has to do with, the attention economy. And I want to understand, so what gets in the way of our curiosity and what gets in the way maybe of our interest, of letting our attention be governed by those forces, letting our attention be governed by our genuine interests, our genuine curiosities, instead of letting it be governed by the images or notifications that pop up on our phones and that are, distracting us from acquiring knowledge and understanding that are genuinely valuable to us, that we're genuinely interested in.
One thing that stops me about being very much interested in curiosity as you are is, to me, it seems like curiosity could be reduced to some, desire to know, or if I am curious. If you look at from this episodic sense of curiosity, yes, it has its own phenomenological properties that definitely maybe cannot be easily reduced to another mental state, but functionally and how it functions, it seems to me very similar to the desire to know something, so my interest shifts immediately when I think about it like that to, I'm interested in how we act, what are the things that guides our action, and mostly we take those things to be like desires and beliefs. And since curiosity seems like to me functionally very similar to desire to know, then I find myself interested in desires, or this kind of more fundamental mental state that I can research on. I don't know. I'm not saying that curiosity in all of its qualities could be reduced to that, but I'm not sure whether you would agree that desire is more fundamental than the curiosity.
But I don't see our mental life as reducible to beliefs and desires.
That's true. I also don't want to say that, actually. Yeah, I wouldn't.
And I think curiosity is an emotion, which is another very important fundamental mental category of mental events and processes. And so that's interesting to me, of why we have this affective reaction that immediately motivates us to gain knowledge, inquire about a certain specific thing, why it feels good to us, why we have this positively valenced reaction to the potential gain of knowledge, the potential gain of understanding that a given stimulus promises to give us. We could, if we were indifferent to the potential for gaining, for improving our knowledge stores, we would be very different creatures.
Yeah. I mean, this emotion part and like the other qualities definitely makes it worth to discover more. Like, so yeah, I also don't want to commit to the view that beliefs and desires could explain all human action. So, yeah.
So curiosity here is like the pre-acquisition phenomenological state, right? So that's kind of what because then you also have something like the anticipation of a payoff also from learning, which is interesting. So curiosity almost has this triggering effect where I experience a state, it drives me towards information. I'm feeling something as I'm driven towards the information. After I acquire the information, it's no longer curiosity because the curiosity has been fulfilled. And now I have some kind of positive affective state separate from that. That's like satisfaction or something like that. Does that track?
Yeah, it can be satisfaction. It can also be confidence that the knowledge or understanding or cognitive mastery I've just acquired, that's a set of abilities I can now use. I can now feel confident in making assertions and explaining different phenomena. So there's also the pleasure of cognitive mastery, whereby you've not only improved your knowledge, but you understand that you can use this knowledge in making different connections.
There's like the creeping in of the evolutionary argument again, and the kind of instrumentality towards the self of curiosity, which I don't disagree with. I think it is a good explanation of why curiosity as a phenomenon exists, why we have that. But yeah, I do think that that's a lot of the case, is that after we learn something, there is some satisfaction about ourselves. We can update something. And I think it's important to, at least for me, like to know and make that distinction, because then there's some folks who say the only reason why we engage epistemically with anything at all is to then have justifications in an argument or to display it to other people, which I think is very flawed in that it's too built on this like evolutionary psychology hangover, because I think that there can be I think that the acquisition of information in a way that improves our sense of self isn't necessarily instrumental in that we then think immediately that we're going to use it against others as justification. And I think there's a distinction we can make there.
I mean, surely there's a more basic point that surely even if we were isolated from others, we have this basic interest in understanding how our surrounding world works and how we can use it to fulfill our needs and desires. And
in a zombie apocalypse, like if the world was ending and I could just live it out in a library until I died and I was going to die anyway, I'd continue to live to read. Like, I'd be very happy with that. I'm not going to meet another human. There's enough food. I'd live in that library until I die. I'd be happy with that.
Good to know.
I just want to challenge you on something, because I have the tendency to analyze this curiosity, the notion of curiosity, in a more functional way, like say, in terms of how it functions. But you are more focusing on like the episodes that we are having when we are curious. Like, it matters what we feel, like the emotional part, that matters a lot to you. But
the feeling has a function.
Yeah, that's true. But what I'm trying to get to is like, that is, imagine that, I don't know, in a different world, like planet, there are people who don't feel anything, like don't have any emotions or anything like that. And they can only use their part of brain that they just very this rationalized, like more robotic, like robots. Maybe AI is even a better example. Like, can they not get curious about, like, if they do not undergo this special feeling, the curiosity necessitates, according to you? Like, is it necessary for them to be curious, that they should undergo this like phenomenological experience? I don't know.
For them to have the kind of intrinsic motivation to seek knowledge for its own sake, I think understanding the intrinsic value of knowledge rather than the instrumental value of knowledge requires creatures to go through and to be able to experience curiosity as the psychological state of the positively valenced psychological state whereby we understand that a specific piece of information would be valuable, would be positive for us to acquire. Of course, again, I can be motivated, I can understand that I need a certain piece of information for instrumental reasons to satisfy my further needs and desires. But there's something about experiencing what would motivate someone unable to experience positive affective valence to just spend one more hour of their time, precious energy and precious resources in the library, finishing a book on the solar system. It's not clear what would motivate such a creature to do that, and how it would be rational for them to but just want to know. There needs to be some experienced value in that.
No, I see.
I disagree. That's a tough one. So I think the entirety of the phenomenological gradient, right, is like a biological incentivization mechanism. So it's nice that we have towards behaviors, and it's nice that we have the phenomenology, and I think that drives us. But when we have a goal in mind, if we have a belief regarding an outcome, I can then act in a way which other people might ascribe curiosity to, but I can have no phenomenological experience. So I think that a race you can program in AI to identify gaps in its own knowledge and then gather that information, and it's not going to have a phenomenological experience. So while I think that that's a very beautiful and profound aspect of the human experience, and it's important for human curiosity, I think that you can very efficiently gather information and learn because you have an objective. And that objective is not, I want to make myself feel good. Like if I'm trying to put a rover on Mars, I don't need to be curious about orbital mechanics, jet propulsion. I can say this is all instrumental for the goal. So I don't think you need emotion for the curiosity. I think while you might need emotion for curiosity, you don't need curiosity for the acquisition of information.
I mean, in the cases we're describing, the goal, as you said, the goal is just to learn. The goal is just to acquire this specific piece of knowledge for its own sake. What I'm saying is, if we didn't have the capacity to experience curiosity, this goal would make no sense to us. We would not generate, we would not have the disposition to generate or activate this goal. It would have no place in our psychology.
Survival. Say I'm building a rover on Mars because I want to build a spaceship to go to Mars so I can live on Mars because Earth's uninhabitable. I'm not curious. I have an instrumental goal for survival. Yeah.
But that's not curiosity under...
No, and I agree with you that curiosity, the only thing I'm pushing back on is that you can't be driven towards the acquisition of information or successful, in a sense. Like it's just the toy example of AI or another species on a different planet that has no motion. They would still be equally successful at accomplishing tasks if they have goals, if the goal is survival.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But
cool.
what I'm maintaining
Yeah.
is that it's one thing for a creature to be very successful at achieving their goals. It's another for them to have the kind of relationship that we humans have to knowledge, which is that, and some philosophers have argued that this is what makes us unique, that we seek knowledge for its own sake. Why? Because maybe the answer is because we have curiosity.
Yeah, I get it.
That probably, plausibly increases our fitness, but that doesn't mean that you're not a functional creature if you don't have it. I'm just saying that you're still very different kind of creatures than the creatures we are.
Yeah. No, that's very fair. And I think that the thing that comes to mind is the relationship between science and, say, like governance or industrial complexes, especially like science as a tool of war comes to mind, because you have the instrumentality of science, mechanics, engineering, etc. But then you have the people doing it regardless because they're curious. They're sort of satisfying it. And you have this sort of interplay where without in the way our economy is structured, which is highly flawed, without the financial incentive, you can't actually drive forward the science, which is inherently flawed and not necessarily at all, because like you said, we have curiosity and that's what makes us unique and we don't need this. But then we have situations where, which was amazing, we had already people working on mRNA vaccines, plausibly because they're curious and also they see the benefit. But then you put a bunch of money towards the COVID vaccine, and we had a COVID vaccine so fast. It was incredible, faster than we've had any vaccine ever. And ostensibly a lot of people working on that were just working on it because there was just like, okay, cool, there's funding and I can continue to do the research. So I think there's this interesting balance there where while curiosity makes us unique and has facilitated the society that we have now, I don't think that it is valued enough, and it almost takes a secondary place to financial incentive, which is very sad. But I think that that's almost what's happened. I don't know if you two see it the same way.
Because the people who experience the curiosity are different from the people who can throw the money at the curiosity.
Yeah, exactly.
And you have to actually experience the curiosity, which speaks to my point,
right.
to actually get to apprehend the value of that knowledge.
Yeah. You have to experience the flower to understand the flower's beauty. It's just like you can't be told it.
That's right. No, I think also we are all on board that an AI cannot be curious or something, right? That's, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Cool. That's the consensus.
Yeah. I think that's a good consensus.
We kind of left the bias behind a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's ultimately really interesting because whenever we try to apply to any broader social circumstance, like we kind of identified before, it's really important in things like jurisprudence and the education system is the things we have exposure to will bias us in certain ways and then not lead us to have those sort of curiosity revelations almost, the feelings of, oh, I ought to know this thing. And if it's from somebody that you devalue because you don't even realize because you haven't even been exposed, I think that's the detriment of all of society, which is obviously what's happening, and we're trying to remedy it. But I think here bias is such a bigger component of how our societies function than curiosity, which is almost like relegated as a luxury.
Yeah. I mean, last time we talked about this whole debate about epistemic injustice, right? Like some people are treated as like knowers and epistemic sources, and some are not because of their membership in a social category. And it is very relevant about like whether when we don't show interest in what people say based on their where they belong to, like based on their backgrounds, like this leads to this epistemic injustice that we are talking about. Because if, I don't know, like women of color speaks up in a meeting and people do not show interest in what she says because of she's a people of color, and she's a woman. So this again leads to this idea that she is not taken as this epistemic source that's actually like committing this injustice.
But again, each instance, each episode is an opportunity to, you're not, manifesting interest, manifesting curiosity, reveals your sensibility. We all have sets of sensibilities. We're more curious, more interested in certain topics, in certain people, certain things rather than others. But this set of sensibilities is not fixed. It's ever changing. You go about your day, you go through the world, you learn, your image of the world is ever expanding. And there are things you can actively do to refine your sensibilities, to question which people, which things, what range of people deserve attention, interest, curiosity. And so you can actively revise your sensibilities, meaning which input, which sources you're going to be sensitive to, react to with interest. And so that's where we circle back to virtuous tendencies of self-questioning and self-reflection. That countering this idea that, we are stuck with our implicit biases and the best thing to do is to pretend and feel ashamed and hide because these are essential parts of my personality that I'm stuck with. This, I think, is extremely counterproductive and false image of our psychology.
That's why I liked when you talked about taking interest. To me, it seemed like, maybe I'm wrong, but something that you could do voluntarily, like unlike curiosity, maybe, because curiosity needs this thing that it happens to you, kind of. It looks like you have less control, But in taking interest, it seems like to me that you can have some kind of control about the things that you take interest in also. So
I love this idea that there is this loop of like, yes, a lot of our reactions are spontaneous. What we're going to be spontaneously curious about, spontaneously interested in, we might not have control about, but we do have this amazing control with our cognition of self-reflection, of meta-emotion on our reactions, and we can decide to actively attend to and take an interest and enter what I like to call an epistemic playground. So I think we can decide to get interested, get curious, and turn certain environments, certain people, certain discussions in occasions for asking questions and enter this kind of state of mind voluntarily, deliberately.
Yeah, as a sort of small empirical point, like what we see is that sort of back to the explore-exploit paradigm is children inherently explore a lot more than adults if you give them a game. And the interesting thing is if you create a situation where the adults don't perceive a particular outcome by which they might compare themselves, in their performance to others, they shift much more to exploratory. So it's very interesting that adults the shift happens in adolescence, where adolescents start exploiting a situation more than younger children do. Meaning if they have a situation where they can get points or perform well, they will do that rather than explore the space. But if you don't give adolescents or adults that goal of points, they just kind of explore. They don't go for these visual rewards. So I find that quite interesting, is that the way that we construct our societies such that, we've sort of fabricated the notions of scarcity, we've built in this idea of competition, makes people think that they ought not be curious, that everything needs to have an instrumental value. People think I wish I had time, like you said before, I wish I had time to read a book or explore something I'm curious about. But if a lot of people talk about feeling guilty because they read instead of work. And I think that's highly problematic, with the way we've built things. And so it's like one of the crucial things that we need to kind of build back in is reduce the competition incentive and sort of rebuild this idea of just kind of explore the things that you want to explore.
Yeah.
Yeah, and especially in like social contexts of conversations that we were discussing, a lot of social encounters and interactions are highly scripted, such that you have this like in a game, you have this goal, this highly constrained contexts. You know the range of possible responses to the possible questions, and you just leave it at that and engage in this kind of game of small talk that is just the highly reductive with respect to what's possible, especially if you were to adopt this more playful, open, curious state of mind of the possibilities are so much broader than than you're brought to think.
Yeah, there's I've had the conversation with two different people I tried to have on the podcast, but they were like, okay, so you give me the questions and then we'll rehearse. And I was like, no. That is the opposite. Like, this should just be joyful and easy and conversational and spontaneous, and we should explore the curiosity. We should be feeling that. But it's interesting how some people are like, oh, then I can't do it. Because it's a very different, the idea for them is very different. And I can get it, but it's just such a different conception. And so I'm really thankful when people come on, because they're like, yeah, I get it. This is fun. Let's do this thing. Let's have this conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
But I'm really grateful for the opportunity to become curious and interested in your ideas, Pelin, and in your ideas, Johan.
Yeah.
Spontaneously so, and deliberately so.
Maybe we can wrap it up there. But thank you both so much for coming on again.
Thank you. This was great.